Hello there, I'm Daniel Horan. I'm a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, where I have the privilege of directing the Center for the Study of Spirituality. I'm also affiliated professor of spirituality here at the Oade School of Theology, and it is my very distinct honor to be here with Professor Sandra Schneiders, IHM, Professor Emerita at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University, who is here at the Oade School of Theology for this conversation about the study of spirituality. Welcome, first of all. Welcome back to OST, where you are not only beloved, but have quite a history of connection here. Yeah. Maybe a good place to begin would you mind just saying how you first came to know about the Oade School of Theology?
I really don't know. I was looking for a place to write a book. I'm not sure whether Oade had some kind of a program or arrangement, but it turned out that it was possible for me to be there at Oade and to have a place to live right nearby. And I also taught a course during the time that I was, or maybe two, during the time that I was there, but I was mostly spending my time writing. And as you know, the climate was lovely, and the accommodations were wonderful, and I was young and frisky, and the library was good. So it really was a very blessed time for me, and we basically stayed in touch. Many of the people who were on the faculty then are still on the faculty, so it's just kept up, and I've been back a few times to lecture, and as I mentioned as we started this last conference, I actually finished my first book at Oade, so I have kind of a feeling that Oade has some parental relationship to my academic life.
That's fantastic, and it does. I mean, life is coming full circle in so many ways. As the conference you're referencing in your honor was titled "Resurrection in the Age of Uncertainty," and it's just extraordinary experience. Great papers, great conversation, and friendship. And one of the key things that was lifted up in this conference was your foundational work in the study of spirituality as a discipline, the emergence of the field for which Oade School of Theology continues to be such an important player and fostering conversation and research. As this is a question that I know a lot of folks in this series have been asked, but I feel deeply honored to be able to ask one of the founding mothers of the discipline itself. How would you define the academic discipline or study of spirituality? A question you've been asked many times over the decades.
I've been asked many times, and there are some long and intricate answers to it. Essentially what it is, as is the case with most disciplines, it's an organized, methodical, structured study of a phenomenon, and the phenomenon in question was not recognized as such around the time that I was first writing. And that is, people really didn't think that spirituality was something you could study. You could practice it, or a religious order could have a particular spirituality. This is a Jesuit spirituality, or this is a IHM spirituality. But the idea that this could be studied the way you study systematic theology or biblical studies and so on, people thought of it as kind of a piety or something completely personal to an individual. But the idea that you could actually study it, and it should have been obvious long since that you could, because there's an enormous literary corpus. You got all the writings of the Jesuit fathers and mothers from the very, very beginning, and you can go back even further. That one can, it seems strange to say this, but one can study Scripture as if it were a spiritual classic. Yeah. At the time that the discipline of spirituality was being born, the opposite was happening in biblical studies. It was becoming so scientized that if you said, and I did, I'd like to study biblical spirituality, it was like, well, you can study the Bible, that's serious scientific study, and you can talk about spirituality, but the one was considered a science, not literature. Now we say, the literary approach to Scripture is far more spiritually productive, personally nourishing than historical, critical, scientific study. Exactly the opposite was happening in spirituality, that people thought that was you and Jesus, and whatever, floated your spiritual boat. But the idea that, and when you think about it, that's kind of bizarre, because you can fill an entire library with the writings of the spiritual giants of the Christian tradition, going all the way back to the 2nd, 3rd century. Some of the greatest spiritual writing ever done was done, and it's been constant. Yeah. There hasn't really been a time when people were not, and all the genres. You've got religious rules that were written. All the works of the fathers of the church are basically works in spirituality. Yeah.
Well, this bias that you're talking about reminds me of a story that the Capuchin historian Regis Armstrong likes to tell about a meeting he was at, where somebody who was a systematician, I believe, or a historical theologian came up to him and said, and what is it that you teach? And he says, well, I teach spirituality. And this person says, oh, spirituality. He goes, theology is to spirituality as cheese is to cheese whiz. Oh. And so this sort of bias that this is like not serious, or it's extra, or it's something on the side, or fluffy, but there's a depth to it. It's the foundation, as you say.
Well, I think with a lot of people, what they thought was what we used to call devotional religion. So there's real religion. That means you go to church when you're supposed to, you keep the commandments and so on. That's real religion. And then there's devotional religion. Well, like if you pray and if you have devotion to the Sacred Heart. So you had this kind of non-obligatory, non-organized, and anybody could do it because it didn't take much of anything. And then you had serious religion that had obligations and a moral code and so on. So it was caught in the same, in one sense, the misunderstanding arose from the actual practice. That there were things you had to do if you were going to go to heaven. You had to keep the commandments, you had to say your prayers, you had to, and then there were other things that if you wanted a higher place in heaven, or a different place in heaven, you had these kind of supererogatory things. You could say the rosary, you could fast when you didn't have to, but these were not obligatory and not constitutive. If you kept the commandments and if you fulfill the duties of your state in life, that would get you to heaven. That qualified you as religious in the way you were supposed to be. And then if you wanted to add some of these other things, and then you could get to a third level, and you had mystics who had experiences that most people didn't have. And that's fine if they wanted to write about that and talk about that. So what we're seeing today in the field is recognizing that basically living our faith involves all of these things. It involves obligations, it involves practices, but it definitely involves theology. But it has, when you say spirituality, you're talking about an integration of all of these things as not only a dimension, but the shape of a person's life with God throughout their entire life. So it took quite a bit of thinking about what we were doing and what we were saying for this to begin to emerge.
Well, and this transition that you're talking about really takes place, and you have been so instrumental both in its foundations in the 1980s and 90s with the emergence of a more rigorous methodologically grounded approach to the study of spirituality. As we think about 2023 and beyond, moving forward, where we are in the academy and in the church and in the world today, how would you say spirituality is involved or can offer something to contemporary Christian life?
Well, I think it obvious. I mean, once people woke up to, oh, there's something here to look at. I mean, we certainly realized that people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Mother Teresa of Calcutta or Pope John the 23rd, or, I mean, everybody has their own heroes, but we recognize the fact that people whose primary contribution to the world is who they are, who they were, in terms of their own interior life and its overflow in the world. And so that's the, you can't not take that seriously. We used to be able to not take it seriously because we had equated it with devotional practices of one kind or another, or some people who kind of got all mushy about God. But there always was this serious dimension of it. For example, nobody thought that reading the mystics was personal piety, but very few people read the mystics. And you couldn't go to university and study the mystics. You could study theology, that was serious, but so between it being either super mysterious that ordinary people couldn't understand it, and it's being kind of light and frothy, so serious people didn't do that. And I can't tell you how many times people said to me, well, you're intelligent enough to do theology, why would you go into spirituality? And the implication was, well, there's no there. I mean, it's a nice thing to be interested in if you happen to like pictures of the saints.
But it's like theology light, or
yes.
To use Armstrong's, it's the cheese whiz, not the real cheese.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that, if somebody was intelligent enough to do the real thing, and to some extent, a little, not nearly as seriously, the same thing was true with biblical studies and theology. That, if somebody went into biblical studies and got into that literary stuff and stuff, but if they really had the brains to do it, they ought to go into systematic theology, which is the further we get from that, looking at it, the more it betrays something we'd rather not have be true of us, which is what we can control rather than what God does this is serious. What God does, well, you never know. Somebody thinks they have mystical experiences and somebody thinks their heart is on fire with the love of God. Well, fine, good, I'm happy for you. But the things and the control agenda is just as strong in theology as it is in most other disciplines.
Absolutely, and we see that, I think, sadly, in a polarized church and a polarized society where, folks who are looking for kind of clear, binary, black and white ways of thinking are gravitate to that sort of reduced understanding of theology and therefore spirituality. We've touched on already a number of areas that you've been, over the course of your very productive and influential career, touched on. I think of Sandra Schneiders, the biblical scholar, the scholar of spirituality, the scholar of religious life. Of course, your 3 volumes are so impactful and important on the theology and spirituality and history of religious life. How do you understand your work in the field? Who is Sandra Schneiders for Sandra Schneiders?
Well, all of the above. So I always say, when people say, well, now, if you had to choose, would you choose your career as a scholar of spirituality? Would you choose biblical studies? Would you choose theology? And I say yes. because they're not separate canisters in my life. I guess I've always been interested in reflecting on my experience, reflecting on what I'm thinking, on what I'm seeing, on what I think is going on around me, and because all of these things are, I would say, equally important in my life.
Yeah.
I wanted to look seriously and systematically and methodically and with the best possible resources for understanding at these things that were important to me. And also, I think I've maybe not thought about it explicitly, but that it's always been clear to me that these things that were important to me were important for other people.
Yes.
And that to be able to help people thematize their experience, to help people see coherence to help people see the coherence between something like biblical revelation and the spiritual life. And the fact that I could, by God's gift, express in writing and orally some of these connections and so on, it's always been a great joy to me in terms of teaching, lecturing, and so on, to see that light dawn in somebody's eyes when they say, I've always known that, I just didn't know I knew it.
Wow, yeah.
You know, and you say it you put it out there, and someone says, "Oh, now I understand what I'm experiencing, what I'm doing," and I think that's a great joy of teaching.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking of teaching, we've mentioned already that we're here at the Oade School of Theology, and this conversation's taking place on the weekend where a conference in your honor has been held. We've also talked a bit about how this place has had a special historical role in your own career, the birthplace of your first book and that sort of thing. Can you say a little bit maybe about your experience of the Oade School of Theology and its emphasis and commitment to the study of spirituality?
Yeah, I was probably here working on New Wineskins, which was my first book before the trilogy. I'm trying to think of when that was. It had to be 35 years ago, whatever. But I was pretty close to the beginning of my own professional career. Well, there were a lot of nice things about being at Oade, but one of them was it was a religious atmosphere. It was a religious order of men, but you didn't have to kind of explain what a strange creature, like a religious was. Yeah. And it was, there was a lot in common. I mean, besides the fact that, which actually just became fully conscious to me when I was working on this, that the oblates of Mary Immaculate and the servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Yeah. So I think there was some commonality in the realm of spirituality. And then I had some friends who were oblates, and unlike many male clerics that I've had to deal with in my career, they seemed to me to be primarily religious who served the church in ordained ministry as opposed to priests. So I felt very at home there as a religious. Yeah. And then also they offered me incredible hospitality in terms of where I lived and the run I had of the campus and my office, and it was a wonderful place to work. And of course the climate after Michigan didn't bother me at all.
Especially come wintertime, winter in San Antonio. Yeah.
And that's where I was there during the winter. So it was just kind of a natural fit, and I didn't really have to explain to people why I wanted to study religious life. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, well, you're smart enough to do something serious, whereas with the Oblates, they understood very well why I wanted to do this work on religious life.
Well, and I think that says a lot too about, the foundations and the continuity over the many years here at the Oade School, the sense of religious life, the sense of commitment to spirituality, and it growing, especially under the presidency of Father Ron Rollheiser and the vision to create a unique doctoral program in spirituality, which would not have been possible, as we heard echoed throughout this conference, without your pioneering work and the work of colleagues of yours like Bernie McGinn and David Tracy and Philip Sheldrake and so many others. So I know we're very grateful here, not only for the personal connection, but also the intellectual and historical connection of your work. It continues to live on in the work of students and faculty in their research here. Maybe one last question, which is you offer such a wealth of wisdom and experience and perspective. What advice would you give to somebody today, a woman or a man who's interested in studying spirituality? What would Sandra Schneiders say to them?
Well, I think I'd probably start by asking them questions, and not ones that they could easily recognize, but ones that would give me an insight into where on the map of spirituality you might place this person. And sometimes people have a burning interest, and that they're working on something in their own life and they know they need resources. So it's kind of like the person who gets interested in medicine because they have a sneaking suspicion they might have cancer. And the positive version of that. Most people, I think, in my experience anyway, most people who go into spirituality go into it for that reason. It's not that they have a general interest in this dimension of the Christian phenomenon. They're usually, sometimes it's problematic. For example, let's say somebody who's gay and Catholic and understands the rejection that is implicit in so much of the Catholic ethos in regard to somebody who's gay. So they may come in through an issue like that, and they want to study the history of Christian spirituality and all kinds of things, seeing what might throw light on their experienced anomalous condition. And then people who have had experiences in prayer that they know are positive, but there's no area of discourse within which they can explore that sort of thing. So people go into spirituality for all kinds of personal reasons, which I think is probably true whether they know it or not in most areas. I mean, people don't just sit down and say, well, let me see, I think I'll do calculus. There's usually some kind of personal involvement. But I think it's especially clear in spirituality, because you only get interested in studying other people's spirituality when you're pretty deeply in touch with your own. So somebody who's had certain experiences in prayer might say, well, I've always been interested in studying the mystics, but the thing is, there's nothing in the ordinary books that talks about the experiences that are so meaningful to them. And so they want to look at this, all kinds of things. Like my bent was toward biblical spirituality, but that came probably from the fact that I was so moved by literature of all sorts. And here was literature that was about the thing that I was most interested in, which was spirituality. So it was kind of a wedding. But I think in helping students, guiding students, that if you could get at what the passion is that was touched off in them, you can much more effectively guide them so that they are finding not only answers to questions, but resources for becoming who they feel called to be.
I think that's great wisdom and advice for an age in which a lot of people are, maybe, especially younger people, hesitant about or skeptical about institutional religious belonging, but are deep spiritual seekers who are looking for meaning in the world. And so asking those questions, the questions of themselves and others and of the tradition is really fantastic. Well, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us here at the Oade School of Theology and to talk about your career, about your insights, your advice to future generations and those who are on the path to seeking answers to their spiritual questions. And so congratulations again on this conference, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, I just want to thank Oade for really quite an incredible experience. And for the friendship down the years, for, in a certain sense, kicking off my career way back when I was here. I was floored by the invitation. I just didn't know where it came from, but it just cements my relationship with the school, and I'm so deeply appreciative.
Oh, we're so grateful ourselves. Thank you.
You're welcome.